PTV نیوز کے اسلام آباد اسٹوڈیو سے آپ دیکھ رہے ہیں ریاست. میں ہوں احمد قریشی. آج سے آپ کو یاد ہوگا کچھ عرصے پہلے وزیر اعظم عمران خان صاحب نے ایک مکالمہ شروع کیا تھا. مختلف جو تھنکرز ہیں مسلم تھنکرز دنیا بھر میں اور بالخصوص مغرب میں، اور وزیر اعظم صاحب کی اس میں ذاتی جو ہے بہت دلچسپی ہے اور مختلف مواقع پر وہ اس موضوع پہ بات کر چکے ہیں. اچھا، یہ ٹاپک جو ہے بہت اہم ہے اور وہ اس لیے ہے کہ ابھی ایک کتاب جاری ہوئی ہے امریکہ میں، اور اس کتاب کا نام ہے اسلام، Authoritarianism and Underdevelopment, a Historical Comparison. مقصد یہ اس کتاب کا کہ یہ تین چیزوں کو ایک موازنہ کر رہی ہے، تین چیزوں کا، اسلام کا اور ڈکٹیٹرشپ یعنی کہ Authoritarianism، ڈکٹیٹرشپ، اسلام، ڈکٹیٹرشپ اور انڈر ڈیولپمنٹ، کہ ڈیولپمنٹ میں کسی بھی معاشرے یا ملک میں کمی. اور یہ اس کتاب کا مقصد جو ہے وہ ڈسکس کرنا وہ کیا ہے، وہ یہ ہے کہ کیا واقعی اسلام جو ہے وہ تمدن کے ساتھ نہیں چل سکتا؟ کیا مسلمان جو ہیں وہ ڈیولپمنٹ میں آگے نہیں جا سکتے اور انہوں نے ہمیشہ انڈر ڈیولپڈ رہنا ہے؟ یہ سوال کسی امریکی یا غیر مسلمان نے نہیں کیا، بلکہ ترکی کے معروف ایک اسلامی تھنکر ہیں اور ان کا نام ہے پروفیسر ڈاکٹر احمد کورو، اور یہ ان کی کتاب ہے. اور یہ کتاب انگریزی میں ہے. یہ کتاب فارسی میں ٹرانسلیٹ ہو چکی ہے، یعنی ایران میں جو ہے ڈسٹریبیوٹ ہو رہی ہے، ترکی میں اور باقی دنیا میں انگریزی میں موجود ہے، ایران میں فارسی میں ٹرانسلیٹ ہو گئی ہے. پورا یہ جو مڈل ایسٹ عربی زبان ہے، کوئی 300-400 ملین عربی بولنے والے ہیں، وہاں پہ یہ کتاب دستیاب ہے. عربی میں ترجمہ اس کا ہو چکا ہے. دنیا کا سب سے بڑا مسلمان ملک ہے انڈونیشیا کی جو زبان ہے بھاشا، اس زبان میں یہ کتاب ترجمہ کے ساتھ مارکیٹ میں آ چکی ہے. اور اب باری ہے پاکستان میں اردو زبان میں اس کتاب کی لانچ کا. اور یہ کتاب کا جو اردو ترجمہ ہے وہ اقبال انسٹیٹیوٹ فار انٹرنیشنل ڈائیلاگ، جو کہ انٹرنیشنل اسلامک یونیورسٹی میں واقع ہے یہاں اسلام آباد میں ہی. اور اقبال انسٹیٹیوٹ کا جو مشن اسٹیٹمنٹ ہے، بیسکلی میں ان کی ویب سائٹ چیک کر رہا تھا، وہ یہ ہے کہ ہم نے مختلف مذاہب کے درمیان مکالمہ کروانا ہے اور رواداری کو فروغ دینا ہے اور ایک دوسرے کو سمجھنا ہے اور دنیا کے ساتھ بھی چلنا ہے اور دنیا کو ہم مسلمانوں کے بارے میں بھی آگاہ کرنا ہے. تو اقبال انسٹیٹیوٹ جو ہے وہ مناسب ترین یعنی کہ ادارہ ہے، موزوں ترین ادارہ ہے جو ترجمہ کر سکتا ہے اس کتاب کا، جو پروفیسر ڈاکٹر احمد کورو نے. اچھا، پروفیسر ڈاکٹر احمد کورو جو ہیں وہ اسسٹنٹ پروفیسر ہیں پولیٹیکل سائنس کے امریکہ میں، سین ڈیگو اسٹیٹ یونیورسٹی میں. تو یہ کتاب جو ہے بہت دلچسپ ہے کہ کیا وجہ ہے کہ مسلمان 1000 سال پہلے ایڈوانسڈ معاشرہ تھا، ایڈوانس سوسائٹی تھی، اور ہم ٹیچرز تھے مغرب کے، اور آج 100 سال بعد جو ہے 1000 سال بعد جو ہے مسلمانوں کا جو موازنہ جب تذکرہ ہوتا ہے تو وہ تذکرہ ہوتا ہے ڈکٹیٹرشپ، اتھارٹیرینزم اور انڈر ڈیولپمنٹ، غیر ترقی یافتہ معاشرے اور غیر ترقی یافتہ ممالک میں. تو یہ میں نے سوچا، میں نے یہ کتاب دیکھی اور میں نے یہ دیکھا کہ ہمارے یہاں بھی یہ بحث چلی، اور سب سے پہلے جو ہے وزیر اعظم صاحب نے خود اس پہ ڈسکشن کی اور دنیا کے تھنکرز اور علماء ان کے ساتھ مکالمے بھی 2-3 وہ کر چکے ہیں. تو میں لکی ہوں ایک طرح سے کہ میں نے رابطہ کیا مصنف سے، پروفیسر ڈاکٹر احمد کورو سے، اور میں نے ان سے کہا کہ یہ آپ کی اردو میں کتاب تو آ رہی ہے لیکن انگریزی میں، کیونکہ وہ اردو تو نہیں بولتے، وہ ترکی بولتے ہیں یا انگلش بولتے ہیں، ایک ہم انٹرویو کر لیتے ہیں. تو میں آپ کو بھی دکھانے جا رہا ہوں ان کے ساتھ جو میں نے مختصر ایک ڈسکشن کی اس کتاب کے اوپر. اور اگر آپ کی دلچسپی ہے اس موضوع پہ تو یہ پروفیسر ڈاکٹر احمد کورو ترکی سے ہیں، اور ترکی سے ایک اور تھنکر ہیں، مسلم تھنکر، جن کا نام ہے مصطفیٰ اکیول. اور یہ دونوں جو ہیں ویل نون ہیں اسلامک فلسفی اور اسلامک آئیڈیالوجی کے اوپر، جو دنیا بھر میں بات ہوتی ہے اس پہ یہ دونوں بڑی مشہور شخصیات ہیں. تو میں ایک طرح سے سمجھتا ہوں کہ میں بڑا لکی ہوں کہ پروفیسر ڈاکٹر احمد کورو نے جو ہے ہمیں یہ موقع دیا، اور آپ کے لیے بھی ایک بہت اچھا موقع ہے کہ ان کی بات سنیں. اور آغاز کرتے ہیں ہم اس انٹرویو کا. انگریزی میں ہے انفارچونیٹلی، کہ ہم نے پوری کوشش کی ہے کہ اس کے ساتھ جتنا ممکن ہو سکے ہم اردو ترجمہ ان کی سوچ کا اور باتوں کا جو ہے ساتھ اسکرین پہ فراہم کریں. تو آئیے یہ دیکھیں میرا انٹرویو. So let me begin really by asking you a very simple question. I would say most of the Muslims I know would really get upset if you mention Islam, authoritarianism, and underdevelopment in the same sentence. And here you go, and you venture out and you write a book with that title. What made you do that?
Thank you. It's a pleasure and honor to be in your show. Let me briefly answer your question saying that I don't feel comfortable with the title either. Then you can ask, why did you choose the title for your book? Because it is the reality on the ground. Unfortunately, I have been analyzing Islam and democracy for maybe 20, 25 years, and we are seeing very few Muslim majority democracies. That's why, as a scientific observation, we see the problem of authoritarianism, hence the title emerged from the reality. I wish the reality had been different, so we would have had different titles. Similarly, the problem of underdevelopment regarding economic and social criteria, when we look at literacy rate, schooling, GDP per capita, life expectancy, many Muslim majority countries have scores lower than even world averages. So let alone comparing Muslim countries with the Western countries, but even world averages. So therefore, the title really hurts me. It's a pain in my heart and my mind. That's why I spent about 10 years to really answer the question. And as I tried to elaborate in the very beginning of the book, the question started in my childhood because in Turkey, where I was born and grew up, many people ask, what happened after many years, centuries of glory, especially regarding Muslims, quote-unquote, golden age of science and economy between 8th and 12th centuries. What happened and why are we stuck with these problems today? That's what I'm trying to analyze in the book.
Very fascinating. Now, if I may ask you very bluntly, is it a problem? Is there a problem? I mean, I know I have my answer as a Muslim. I have my answer. And I know we have a number of answers to this question. But I want to pose this question to you. Is there a problem, or is the problem really in Islam as a religion, or is it a problem with the Muslims today?
That's a core question. If you look at the scientific literature, as well as the now dominant right-wing discourses in not only Western countries, but also some secularist discourses in the Middle East, they both or they all blame Islam for underdevelopment. What I really argue in this book is that for at least three main reasons, such argument of blaming Islam is weak and wrong. First, today there are democratic Muslim majority countries and authoritarian Muslim majority countries. The Muslim world, I analyze 50 countries, show us a variation. And the variation include, for example, democratic countries such as Indonesia, Senegal, Albania. Moreover, when we ask Muslim individuals, 85% of them ask and demand democracy. Therefore, the Muslim world is not a monolithic of authoritarian underdeveloped bloc, but it shows a variation. Some Muslim countries are much more developed and democratic. Therefore, blaming Islam is wrong. Second, Islam had a golden era where religion and development and creativity and diversity were perfectly compatible. In fact, Islam was encouraging development at the time. Last but not least, every culture and religions are open to interpretations. Of course, certain interpretations of Islam, for example, jihadi Salafism, are problematic regarding development and certain ideas of progress. But Islam, as a huge civilization and religious tradition, And I'm trying to show how different interpretations of Islam work very well with development from history to the present. That's why, because of these three reasons, it's wrong to single out Islam as the source of problem. And as you nicely put, it is Muslims' history, certain Muslim actors, and their religious and political activities that create the problem.
Very interesting. Of course, I'm going to ask you a question later on about a number of schools of Muslim thought. You referred to one of them, which is Salafism, and we have a number of them really across the Muslim world, and each one of them had its own experiment of trying to better or improve the lot of Muslims with the various results. But we'll come to that a little later. Let me ask you another question, which is, I think, very interesting. You were mentioning Muslim majority nations that are democratic and some which are not. I have an observation for you, and I would like to hear your thought on it. I see, I mean, with the exception of maybe Turkey, to some extent also Indonesia and Pakistan, and to a certain extent Malaysia as well, these are countries, Muslim majority, that experimented with democracy and had some problems. But overall, they went and they moved forward with the experiment. However imperfect it was, and did fairly well. Some, like Turkey, very well, some less well, maybe like Pakistan. Indonesia, Malaysia, you can judge them whichever way you would like. But other than these 3 or 4 countries, you see a very clear division in the Muslim majority nations where, for example, countries that took the republican form of government, like Libya, like Syria, like Iraq, like Lebanon, collapsed. And on the other hand, you see countries, Muslim majority nations, that were either monarchical or not democratic. This includes many countries in the Middle East, Jordan, Morocco, the Gulf states, Oman, but also countries in Central Asia, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, which may not be democracies in that way, but did very well. And these are the Muslim societies which are progressing, are stable, are doing much better in terms of education and so forth, and economy. So Muslim states that took the republican form of government collapsed, and Muslim states which are not democratic, I mean either monarchical or despotic, not exactly democratic, doing better than the ones which took the republican form of government. This is a purely Muslim experiment and Muslim phenomena, I would say. What do you have to say to that?
So, thank you for the question. First of all, we have to differentiate between short-term development and long-term development. The Soviet Union, for example, seemed to be very successful in the first 30, 40 years of its industrialization, but it collapsed by leaving so many problems behind. And the Republican or popular mobilization or uprisings may have led to certain level of short-term distractions and problems, but in the long run, if they establish working democracies, participatory politics, they may lead to a deep and long-lasting development, as we see, for example, in the American Revolution. After certain years of disruption, they established a strong, unified federal system with economic growth. So, regarding the particular cases, yes, during the Arab uprisings, certain Gulf monarchies stand strong in terms of political stability, but political stability doesn't mean deep and sufficient economic growth. It doesn't mean freedom. It doesn't mean participation, and deprivation and the problems of many people persisted. Central Asian autocracies are republics, but they really establish certain despotic instruments and traditions that's less participatory than supposed to be. Therefore, So one thing is long-term, short-term. The other thing is that both monarchies and republics can be long-lasting dictatorship. And the end result generally is not people's happiness. If you look at people's happiness, economic growth, really participatory economic and participatory political systems are necessary. Let me link this to the analysis of my book. When Muslims between 8th and 12th centuries had participatory economics and participatory political systems, they had cutting-edge philosophers, pioneering economists. At the time, Islamic scholars, ulama or mullahs, they were independent of the state authority. Over 90% of ulama were funded by commerce, privately owned businesses, and major leaders of the four mazhabs of Sunni Muslims today, Abu Hanifa, Ahmed bin Hanbal, Maliki, Shafi, they refused to serve the state. They kept their autonomy, intellectual autonomy, which was supported by economic autonomy. But unfortunately, after the 11th century, there emerged what I call an alliance between the state and the ulama. Ulama they were made to servant of the state, and the result is the marginalization of the intellectual class and the marginalization of the economic class. That really make Muslims who were once superior to Western Europe somehow underdeveloped. And today what we really need, an intellectual class, intellectual freedom, and economic entrepreneurship. So both requires limitation of state. If the state controls, as it does in the Gulf Arab monarchies, which were funded by oil money, once the oil money is gone, these countries will have very much difficulty to adapt post-oil era. They need intellectual and economic entrepreneurs to really shape and provide a future for them.
बहुत दिलचस्प गुफ्तगू जारी है प्रोफेसर डॉक्टर अहमद कुरू के साथ इस्लाम पर, डिक्टेटरशिप, अथॉरिटेरियनिज्म और अंडर डेवलपमेंट के मुसलमान क्यों इस वक्त तरक्की याफ्ता माशरों में शुमार नहीं होते और 1000 साल पहले दुनिया के एडवांस तरीन सोसाइटीज़ में उनका शुमार होता था। ये गुफ्तगू हमने जारी रखनी है एक वक्फ़े के बाद मिलते हैं। वेलकम बैक। वापस चलते हैं सैन डिएगो अमेरिका कैलिफोर्निया की तरफ, जहां पे प्रोफेसर डॉक्टर अहमद कुरू मेरे साथ एक मुकालमा कर रहे हैं इस्लाम के ऊपर, डिक्टेटरशिप के ऊपर और क्यों मुसलमान माशरों का शुमार आजकल जो है वो गैर तरक्की याफ्ता माशरों में हो रहा है, जबकि 1000 साल पहले हम एडवांस माशरे थे। ये देखें।
I was listening to you when you gave a comparison or insight really into Muslims in the medieval era, where the Muslim intellectuals were separate from the state. That really goes counter to the trend right now in most of the major Muslim countries in the Islamic world. And I'm referring specifically to the major Muslim countries, Turkey, Indonesia, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, Egypt. The trend today is not to let the mosque and the mosque pulpit run free in order to minimize division in religious thought within the society. So you see a trend where in Egypt, in Morocco, in the Gulf, in Jordan, and in some other countries where there is an emphasis on deep religious education from recognized institutions, and at the same time the state also keeping an eye on what is being said on the pulpit of the mosque, and not let every mosque go in different directions. So you see directions given for Friday prayer sermons, and there are directions given for that. And you see the state taking interest in appointing and paying salaries for the imams of the mosques and the people who deliver the sermons on Fridays and on Eid prayers. So you see a very different trend in modern Muslim thought today as compared to what was the situation as you described during the good times of the Muslim civilization. And of course, there are good reasons why this trend exists today in modern Muslim states, because it has to do with security, it has to do with fighting extremism, it has to do with the emergence of violent extremist groups. How do you reconcile the history with today's demands?
Thank you. So when we look at the current trend, first of all, it is really based on a misunderstanding of Islamic history. I have heard many scholars and activists repeating that religion and state are twins, religion is the foundation, state is the guardian, as some even refer that to Prophet Muhammad alayhi salam. But when I analyze this, I find out that it is a Persian Iranian maxim coming from the Persian governmental thought, the religion and state twins. But in Islamic history, the reality was very different between 8th and 12th centuries, represented by Abu Hanifa and others. Even later, at the time of Imam Ghazali, for example, at the age of 40, Imam Ghazali went to the mausoleum of Prophet Abraham and took an oath that he would never receive money from the state rulers again. He would never teach public madrasas again. He would never even join to their dispute gatherings again. And he spent 11 years or so in his private madrasa and private circle, because he, in Ihya Ulumuddin and other books, he emphasized that there should be a separation and a distance between true scholars and political authorities. Once the two combine, it doesn't allow diversity. And Muslims really become too much under the authority of ulama state alliance, which make Islam too much reduced to the monopoly of this power elite. But in early Islamic golden age, things were different, because at that time Muslims had deep self-confidence. They learned from Greek philosophy. They learned from Indian mathematics. They learn from Sasani Iranian sciences, and then provide their own contributions. And they were very dynamic. Let me give an example. When Muslims learn paper making techniques from China around 750, they immediately pick up, open factories in Baghdad and elsewhere. It was Western Europe which was slow to understand techniques. Western Europe could not produce paper for 500 years. They waited 5 centuries. But what happened later on? When the Western Europe developed the Chinese technique of printing press, Muslims did not take it for 300 years. And when, for example, the Ottoman Empire finally had the first printing press run by Muslims in the 18th century, the Ottomans printed 50,000 books. Whereas at the same century, Western Europeans printed 1 billion books. The result is the literacy rate averaged 1% in the Ottoman Empire, 31% in Western Europe. And the problem of the low literacy continues, unfortunately, until today. So we have to face with these problems, and we have to have a critical engagement with our ideas, institutions, rather than simply blaming the West. Let me wrap up saying that in my book, I engage with 2 arguments. One argument, as we already talked, blaming Islam, which is wrong. The other argument is exclusively blaming Western imperialism and colonization. Yes, Western colonization has been damaging. Even today, there is imperialism. But this is not the only problem. Muslim intellectual stagnation started before colonization. That makes Muslims weaker against imperialists. And today, simply blaming the foreign occupiers make us really blind of our own domestic problems that we have to deal with.
Most of the literature and the modern ideology of political groups that they describe themselves as Islamic groups, political groups. Most of their ideology is based on the simplified idea that the backwardness or the underdevelopment, and obviously underdevelopment is a much more politically correct word than backwardness, and much of the underdevelopment of Muslim societies is because of Western colonization. And you're saying it's not, because you very rightly say that the degradation in Muslim thought started before colonization. And maybe that degradation actually encouraged others to come and interfere and colonize, maybe. So I have a question here, Professor. How do you explain, or first of all, before you explain, have you noticed that whenever you look at the golden era of Muslim thought in the medieval times, where the Muslims were doing very well in terms of development, you see Muslims and you see their literature, their books, their writings focused on things like studying philosophies and the products of civilizations, of other civilizations, the Indian civilization, the Roman civilization, the Persian civilization, the Chinese. Whereas today you see the modern Muslim thought stuck in issues that I would describe as being very small. Things like how women should dress. Things like the intermingling or mixing of men and women at educational institutions, for example, such as what should be the dimensions of women's clothing, and so forth. You have a whole long list of issues. Do you see this shift in Muslim thought, where it used to be on grand issues 1,000 years ago, and today the Muslim thought, even of major political parties, they seem to be focused on very small things? Do you see this very strange comparison?
Unfortunately, I clearly see that. For example, after the 11th and 12th centuries, after this ulama-state alliance first emerged under the Seljuks in Central Asia, Iran, Iraq, they moved with the unintentional help of Crusaders and Mongols toward Egypt, Syria, under Ayyubis, Mamluks, then the Ottomans. They were all military-based and aligned with the ulama, not emphasizing intellectuals so much. But since the early Muslim brilliance was so strong that it kept producing some scholars like Ibn Rushd in today's Spain and Ibn Khaldun in North Africa and Egypt. But these two scholars were mostly neglected by Muslims, and Europeans learned philosophy from Ibn Rushd mostly, and Ibn Khaldun then revived and rediscovered by again Europeans in the 19th century. And these towering figures really show that Muslims, in fact, were the teachers of Europeans. But now there is this problem, because as you rightly point out, so that we didn't have the perspective, the curiosity, and even in religious sciences, let alone mathematics, astronomy, and physical sciences, social sciences, even in religious sciences, the latest major scholars like Taftazani and Jurjani, they live in the early 15th century. In the last 500 years, it's very difficult to point a towering figure in religious sciences like Ghazali, Taftazani, and others. And what we have to do at this point is to really face this reality, acknowledge it, rather than blaming or religion or colonial Western imperial powers. We have to look at the power relations, class relations, how politics monopolize economy, monopolize religion, monopolize social cultural life. We really need a differentiation. We need to give credit to intellectuals and stop being worried about alternative thinkings. And we have to respect coexistence. Let me conclude this answer with an example. In the 9th century, when Muslims established the world's biggest hospital in Baghdad, the chief medical doctors were Jewish and Christians, and Muslims were fine with that. But 500 years later, in today's Egypt, they established another world-renowned hospital, Mansour Hospital. This time, they declared that non-Muslims cannot be medical doctors, non-Muslims cannot be even patient in this hospital. So you see this decline of toleration, this decline of coexistence, which makes us really more close-minded and less productive.
बहुत दिलचस्प गुफ्तगू जारी है प्रोफेसर डॉक्टर अहमद कुरू के साथ इस्लाम पर, डिक्टेटरशिप, ऑथोरिटेरियनिज्म और अंडर डेवलपमेंट के मुसलमान क्यों इस वक्त तरक्की याफ्ता माशरों में शुमार नहीं होते और 1000 साल पहले दुनिया के एडवांस तरीन सोसाइटीज़ में उनका शुमार होता था। ये गुफ्तगू हमने जारी रखनी है एक वक्फे के बाद मिलते हैं। वेलकम बैक। वापस चलते हैं सैन डिएगो अमेरिका कैलिफोर्निया की तरफ, जहां पे प्रोफेसर डॉक्टर अहमद कुरू मेरे साथ एक मुकालमा कर रहे हैं इस्लाम के ऊपर, डिक्टेटरशिप के ऊपर और क्यों मुसलमान माशरों का शुमार आजकल जो है वो गैर तरक्की याफ्ता माशरों में हो रहा है, जबकि 1000 साल पहले हम एडवांस माशरे थे। ये देखें।
One more thing that strikes you, Professor, when you study the good times of Muslim civilization 1,000 or so years ago and the Muslim societies today is the level of self-confidence in Muslims. So 1,000 years ago, a Muslim trader, for example, traveling in East Asia or in Europe, probably would sit with his business partners on a lunch or dinner table, and the business partners would be eating whatever they eat or drink that may not be acceptable for a Muslim in terms of what Muslims eat and drink. But that Muslim trader wouldn't mind actually sitting on that table. And that to replicate that today would create lots of problems for many numbers of Muslims today. Also, 1,000 years ago, I'm sure there must have been many instances in different parts of the world, possibly in Europe, in the Middle East, in Asia, where someone who's not a Muslim came out and denounced Islam or said something which is sacrilegious about Muslims. The Muslim reactions were of different nature, obviously, in different circumstances, but generally there were self-confident responses, whereas it did not really matter much to Muslims then what non-Muslims said or thought about them, because they were confident in who they are. Whereas today we see the slightest statement that reflects the slightest affront or poses a slightest affront to what we feel are our sensibilities, results in no less than major violence. And I think this comparison brings you to one point and one point only, which is the level of self-confidence of Muslims. Do you feel that?
Yes, and again, if you look at the history, in Damascus, under the Muslim rule, in the Umayyad Empire, there was the biggest Christian thinker of the time, and the John of Damascus, and he was writing, publishing, challenging other Christian thinkers in Europe, and he was challenging Muslims too, discussing with them, bringing new ideas and challenges. And Muslims, as you rightly put so, had self-confidence. And being reactionary, being aggressive really means the lack of self-confidence. And strategically, today, we have many problems and tragedies. In Myanmar, in different parts of Asia, there are persecution against Muslims. These are the real problems. And we have to be very strategic. Muslims should be productive. They should have Nobel Prize winners. They should have intellectuals. They should have world-leading economists if they really want to defend the right of Muslims. If they really want to glorify Islam in an appropriate way, chanting on the street, attacking some places, being violent is really not defending Islam. In fact, it is very counterproductive in North America, South America, in Asia and elsewhere. When Muslims show aggressiveness rather than productivity, it contributes negative images, stereotypes, and it is strategically very wrong. And we have serious problems. There's a very strong anti-Muslim sentiments in many Asian countries today. And Muslims should be smart to really respond to this hostility and not to contribute to that. As you nicely said, that we need self-confidence, being smart and strategic on that.
Well, it's a very deep thought, Professor. One that you do not hear a lot, unfortunately, in many parts of the Muslim world. And again, while you were saying these words, your very last words, I was thinking to myself, I have read some writings or heard people say some of the things or ideas that you just espoused here. But again, I heard those ideas or read them again in Muslim countries today that are either despotic or monarchical. So I've read discourses today on Muslim thought that reflect some of what you're saying, and you're sitting in one of the largest democracies in the world. There are a number of them, and one of them is the United States, where you're sitting, and it makes perfect sense what you're saying. But when I'm sitting here in Islamabad, and I know that I read something to this effect in probably Almaty in Kazakhstan, or in Muscat in Oman, and in Dubai, and in Kuwait, and in Jordan, and in Egypt, and I think to myself, and also in Turkey, and I think to myself, you know, most of the reasoning today is really coming from Muslim societies that probably are not as open politically as you would expect, and as I felt you are expecting in your book. But still, they're making that effort. More than that you see that sort of effort. I mean, you don't see that kind of thinking really coming from Muslim countries that are republics. And this is a very, very probably disturbing dichotomy, but it does exist.
Let me combine the two ideas and say that the countries you refer to, including Kazakhstan, Egypt, Pakistan, Turkey, these are very important, very big countries. Even if they don't have sufficiently democratic and open political regimes today, they still produce important thinkers. And imagine what they would produce in the future if they have more participatory, more open systems. And other countries like Libya, with certain problems today, I don't want to offend, but they are smaller countries in terms of population, in terms of the role they play in history. The big countries, major leading countries, Iran, Turkey, Egypt, Pakistan, if they solve their problems and have more participatory and freedom-based systems, I think they will be more productive economically, socially, and then they can really lead others in their neighborhoods.
Interestingly, Professor, and you're right in your observation, but interestingly, today's modern trends in thinking are being shaped by smaller Muslim countries. And you see that in Malaysia, you see that in Azerbaijan, you see that in, to a certain extent, in maybe Jordan, Morocco. So you see increasingly smaller Muslim countries also playing bigger role than traditionally larger states played, which is a whole different discussion, but
Sure.
you make sense, obviously, and we can have that discussion later. In the last few minutes that I have, I would like to ask you a very simple but very blunt question, Professor Kuru. With this book that you've written, and I am no expert, but I know that books such as the one you have written are not many in our part of the world. There are many in where you're sitting, but not many in our part of the world, and not many where by Muslim authors. So your book is distinguished by the fact that it's written by a Muslim author who actually is very close to Islamic thought and feels the pain. So you're not coming from I'm assuming you're not coming from a secular background. You're coming from the background of a Muslim thinker, really, and not a secular thinker per se. Maybe this is my understanding of glancing through your book. I could be right, I could be wrong, but that's a whole different, again, subject. But my question is, what exactly and specifically are you trying to achieve by writing this book?
Thank you. Let me first say that my first book was a critique of secularism in Turkey, inspired by the French laïcité, French secularism. And I was really trying to promote a particular understanding of secular state friendly with religion, not banning headscarves, not banning Muslim symbols. That's my first book, a critique of secularism. With this new book, what I am trying to achieve multiple things, but let me just emphasize one point, which is that Muslim youth today and the future, if and when they try to establish meritocratic, open, participatory political and social systems, they don't really and directly and only imitate Western models. They have inspirations and models in their own history. And the Muslim golden age between 8th and 12th centuries should be examined carefully. There is a cliche in Turkey and in some other Muslim countries that the Muslims' early achievements were all about piety. We were religious, we were successful. Then we stopped being religious, we failed. This is wrong. The reality is much more complex. Of course, religion, particularly Islam, was a positive contributor, but there was much more than that. Muslims achieved scientifically and economically, together with Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, Hindus, and others, being tolerant, open-minded, respecting coexistence, diversity. That was the way of our early achievement, and we can repeat it in the future again, inshallah.
That's a great thought, and I'd like to conclude this session, Professor Kuru, with you, with this very interesting thought that you mentioned. And for my viewers who joined us a little later, we're discussing Professor Ahmed Kuru's latest book, Islam, Authoritarianism, and Underdevelopment, a Global and Historical Comparison. One of the few books with a critical approach to modern Muslim thinking that tackles very simple questions, but very, I would say, deep questions, such as, is Islam and are Muslims compatible with development? And the relationship between Islam, authoritarianism, and what we see today as the underdevelopment of many, many modern Muslim societies. Professor Kuru, thank you very much for joining me, and we look forward here we look forward to the English to the Urdu translation after the Persian, Arabic, and the Bahasa in the Indonesian. We look forward to the Urdu translation of your book by Iqbal Institute, and I'm sure once we do that, once we have that book, let's try to have a discussion with you in Urdu. I'm not sure exactly if that would be possible if you know fully the language, but I'm sure you would have a huge number of readers here in Pakistan.
Thank you. Maybe I can visit Bilal, Pakistan, and we can do it inshallah in person.
मैं फिर से बहुत शुक्रगुजार हूँ प्रोफेसर डॉक्टर अहमद कुरू का सैन डिएगो स्टेट यूनिवर्सिटी में असिस्टेंट प्रोफेसर हैं पॉलिटिकल साइंस के और बेहतरीन किताब है इस्लाम, अथॉरिटेरियनिज्म एंड